Good morning, everybody. I see we have a growing number of participants on the call, so maybe we'll give it another minute before we begin. Okay, why don't we get started? I see we have a good number of people that are joining. A few more may tick in, but in the interest of time and to make sure we're not abusing anybody's calendars, let's get started. This is a discussion of as part of the European Humanitarian Forum, and it is being pre-recorded for the forum. This section is part of a wider effort to engage key humanitarian actors and stakeholders around the issues that we struggle with in providing assistance to countries in conflict and others. As I said, it's pre-recorded because the forum wanted to make the most of to broaden out the voices involved in spite of the COVID situation. So this will be viewed as part of the forum, which happens later. So we're very grateful for you to be a part of that, and we hope we can have a dynamic conversation. The topic of the day is when is the right moment to exit from a humanitarian crisis, looking at the Libya case. My name is Tom Garofalo. I'm the country director for the International Rescue Committee in Libya, and we have three very experienced and distinguished other participants in the panel. I'll be moderating. I want to remind everyone that they should mute themselves. Once we have the initial presentations from the participants and some initial dialogue, we'd like to open up the floor to more conversation. And until then, I just remind everyone to stay muted so that the integrity of the recording is kept. With that, let me just say, we often hear Libya is described as a dynamic context, and this has been proved again in the last 48 hours as we see that rival militias are maneuvering around in support of candidates who would like to lead the new government in Libya. My staff are trying to figure out what this means and trying to stay safe, etc., as many of you are. It obviously raises the question about Libya's long hoped for transition to development. So today is it's a great time to be discussing this. We have, as I said, three very knowledgeable people to talk about this. We're going to start with Gemma San Martin, who is the deputy head of OCHA Libya. She has over 25 years of experience in complex emergencies, especially around analysis and emergency response preparedness. And she's been working on Libya now for several years since I've been there. And so we look forward to her viewpoint from OCHA. Secondly, Jean-Nicolas Marty, who's the head of delegation of the ICRC. Also a long and distinguished career working in many different contexts. Sri Lanka, he's worked out of Geneva for a long time. He was responsible he was working in the unit responsible for armed relations between ICRC and the armed services. Look forward to hearing what he has to offer on the subject. And the conclusion will be by Albert Elliott, who is the country director for DRC. We work together very closely, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say, particularly about this transition and the idea around localization of our strategies to build empowerment in Libya. So with that, let me turn it over to Gemma for the initial presentation. There won't be presentations per se, but Gemma, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, colleagues. I hope you can hear me properly. As you were saying, I mean, we are currently in a very tricky situation. I mean, we have seen the last developments. Maybe if you asked me that question a couple of months ago, I would have said one thing. If you asked me today, I wouldn't be that sure. Probably my answer will be different. I think that this shows how fragile is the current situation in Libya. We have seen how some of the monitoring indicators that we have in place have been improving. It shows that the situation, even though there are still some remaining of humanitarian pocket needs across the country, that the situation was generally kind of going into a better situation from the humanitarian point of view, of course. Said that, of course, it comes a moment where we all question, like, when is the right time to go? When is the right time to maybe transition into development? I think that we need to keep in mind that when we, as OCHA, when we start here to support the government to handle humanitarian emergencies. That means that the moment we go is when the government should be able to respond to onset emergencies. So they should be able to mobilize, to organize among themselves and provide the right assistance to the people in need in their country. In order to build this capacity as OCHA, together with humanitarian partners, we have been working a lot in data collection and analysis training. We have been working a lot in humanitarian principles, protection mainstreaming, and child protection issues also. But is that solid enough at this time? Is it that going to continue along the time in this moment where we don't even know exactly which one is going to be the next government for Libya? Data collection and analysis has been one of the key elements that it was identified as one of the key issues to address in the peer-to-peer missions 2017 and even in 2020. And even though it was pointed out both times there, we are still there. We haven't improved a lot on that. On that regards, as OCHA, we just signed this week an agreement with the Ministry of Social Affairs in order to be able to see how we can build that capacity, how we can work together to enable them to be able to do data collection and analysis. Of course, we don't want to do that individually with the Ministry of Social Affairs. So of course, we will involve REACH on that because of the multi-sectoral needs assessment. We will also work with the intersector coordination groups, the individual sectors, and see if at least during 2022 we can get some more data sets and analysis in a joint manner that will enable the government somehow to do the same exercise in the years coming forward. I think that will be a very significant step. At the same time that we are also very much aware that that might fall in pieces along the way, and we still need to have a plan B in order to be able to develop the humanitarian needs overview for 2023. Another of the aspects that we need to consider before we decide if it is the right moment to go or not is who is going to take over. Are the development streams in place? Is there any coordination structure for development partners to continue building on what we have been putting together with humanitarian response? Is there any framework, coordination mechanisms in place, and so on? This is something that the new RCAC has been dedicating a lot of time and building on, and it's something that I trust maybe by 2023 we will have something in place, but for the time being is still we are in a kind of a transitional moment that we don't really know exactly 100% how that is going to go, especially, as you were saying, considering how the last developments on the ground. But still, we are hopeful that these things will be in place, and for sure they have to be in place before we step out. Another issue is looking at, I mean, we have been discussing this with some of the colleagues, also with some of the donors, with SECO mainly, is what is the added value that we are having as humanitarians? Considering that the funding that we are putting in a country like Libya is a drop on the ocean, maybe we should start looking at transitioning in a phased approach where we move so much on direct assistance into technical advice, technical assistance. They have resources, more than we as international community can provide there. So maybe try to invest in a phased approach, providing some technical advice to the authorities, to the different institutions, try to create a bit much more disaster risk reduction organism inside the government, disaster management capacity, for them to make sure that in case of an onset emergency, they will be able to reorganize themselves and answer to those needs. As you said, you started saying, to have all this in place, we need stability. And at this moment, it's a big question mark in Libya. I haven't seen any country in the world where there is a transitional step without having a bit of a solid stability. Even having that in place when we, as OCHA, left some of the countries, because it was the right decision at that moment, we saw like in few years, we had to come back. And what will be the consequences of coming back, or let's say of leaving too early, and then you have to come back? That will reduce and jeopardize the humanitarian community capacity to scale up and respond in a rapid manner. You need to start winning the trust again. You need to start building the coordination mechanisms. So it's really a tough decision. It's not rocket science. It's not, there's no an SOP for that. But there are some indications that are telling us, okay, make sure the government has capacity to respond. Make sure there is a system for data collection and analysis at government level that can allow them to make the right decision when they make their own budget allocations. Make sure there is a development system, development mechanism in place that is taking over from us and it's addressing the root causes of those needs. What will be the consequences of staying too long? It also has consequences, and we also have to be a bit aware of that, and we need to try to understand, okay, how we can minimize those. Consequences of staying too long, it could be that instead of supporting the government, as is our role, is that we are replacing the government, and that's something we should strongly avoid. I mean, responsibility is always on the host government, and we should not replace them. Then we will be a waste of resources. I mean, if to have any of our offices, being an NGO, being a UN agency, being a donor structure in place, is quite costly, and we shouldn't do that. I mean, unfortunately, there are too many needs on the ground in the world currently, and we really need to be very aware that we should never use waste resources where we shouldn't put efforts on it. But on the other side, yeah, I mean, looking at this scenario in Libya now, as I was telling you, if you asked me 2 months ago, I might have an answer. If you ask me today, I will have a different answer and try to understand, okay, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see, try to understand which level of stability we are going to have in place in order to consolidate all these minimum aspects that needs to be in place. I don't think we need to wait until everything is perfect. We learn from mistakes. And I think that this is something that it will never happen. I mean, it will never be perfect. There is always a reason, but let's not try to prolong our stay longer than necessary either. So this is my introduction. So I will leave the floor to the colleagues also to contribute to that before we open the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Very helpful introduction. Jean-Nicolas, would you like to go next?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I can concur with many of the points that were presented by Gemma, especially on the radical uncertainty of the situation today in Libya. Remember, a bit less than a year ago, we had a kind of a scenario in the ICRC saying that we were cautiously optimist about the situation. Back in September, we were already rather pessimistic, but today I have to say that it's definitely a situation in which we have to watch very carefully what is happening. But let's zoom out a little bit after the today's situation or this weekend situation in Tripoli and around. And I have to say that I've struggled to try to answer this complicated question: when to exit a humanitarian crisis. Do you actually exit? The humanitarian may be existing, but does the crisis exit itself? This is more of a philosophical question. Of course, ideally, we humanitarian, we would like to have a humanitarian response that is intended to be temporary, come in, response, and then leave. But in the long career that Thomas was explaining to you, I have never seen such a place where we come in and we go out as quick as people may think when we first engage. Second, therefore, I have a bit of an issue with this question or this notion of expiry date. And the very notion of the expiry date of an operation is to me completely alien, because I think we have to go for a clear analysis of the needs of the people, and not whether these needs are addressed by these actors or another actors. For example, today in Libya, the ICRC, we are trying to respond to two different kinds of needs. We are working on a master plan for Benghazi sewage system, which is a long-term project. It's a project of hundreds of millions of USD when it will be once presented to development actors to implement. But at the same time, we do respond to still urgent need from some other people. So we have these two parallel tracks of needs, longer term needs for more development type of work that we are working on. We are not a development agency, as you know, but we are preparing the ground or making some analysis ready to be handed over at one point to development actor. Because this links up with one of the points I'm struggling with. Okay, if we decide that this is not anymore an emergency or a humanitarian crisis, we have to have the two fundamental questions. Who will be able to take over these needs? Gemma presented the issue of the government, the authorities, their capacity, their willingness to engage and to go that path. But on the other hand, the development actors, because if we are to leave the humanitarian emergency organizations, are the humanitarian the development actors, the more longer term actors, already able to come in and to take over some of the responsibility, or to take over some of the coordination with the national Libyan authorities. So I think that there is as well a question about the format of such an exit, if we want to call it. There might be a kind of a gradual exit or sequenced exit of humanitarian actors, progressive one. I mean, some may leave earlier, some may stay longer, depending on the sector, depending on what we're talking about. I take one example. We have created with the ICRC in Libya in 2019, in the middle of the battle, a tripartite committee between the LNA and the GNA to discuss humanitarian issues. During the phase of active hostilities, we were engaged with these two in this tripartite mechanism on evacuation of war wounded, repatriation of mortal remains, or safe passages of convoy. Today, this committee is still active. It's, by the way, not anymore called a tripartite because there is no active hostility. We call it a joint committee on IHL and humanitarian issues, where we talk about missing people, where we talk about access for the ICRC to detention places, where we talk about longer-term IHL training to forces. Therefore, this mechanism has transitioned to something longer-term than purely emergency response, but there is still a need for this to exist. And as ICRC, as a neutral intermediary, we are the best place to deal with that particular mechanism. And I tell you that we could, with this mechanism, we can really feel the temperature of what is going on. We have a meeting foreseen with them next week. The latest info I got this morning is that it's still not very sure that we will have this meeting. So, and a few months back, as Gemma mentioned, they were enthusiastic about having joint training, whatever. This is not anymore on the table today. As I said, there are this combination of longer-term and emergency need in Libya. Therefore, before having a kind of an exit strategy or an exit plan, the fundamental response of who is able to take over some of the needs, maybe not all, not all. Gemma puts it very, very clearly. I come from the Sahel region. There's nothing to compare in terms of resources available and potential capacity of a country like Libya. But I think that what counts actually are the people needs, and we should not decide to politically end a humanitarian crisis, but rather look at the suffering of the people in a given context. And I may stop here so I don't speak too long. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Nicolas. Next we have Avril Elliott. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you also to my colleagues, Gemma and Jean-Nicolas, for the insightful comments, and also just a thank you to ECHO for convening us today for this really important discussion. I'll also echo the notion that I've struggled to respond to the question around when is the appropriate time to exit. And I think that we struggle with this question insofar as there isn't really a standardized process, as Gemma referred to. There isn't really an SOP for this. And even it's the case that I'm not sure we even have standardized guiding principles around what would inform an exit strategy per se. So with that, I'd like for us to focus on perhaps three key considerations, particularly around need, as Jean-Nicolas has referred to, and with special reference, I suppose, to the protection environment. I'd also like us to consider transitional processes and what that looks like. And lastly, a key point from my side for us to consider is around accountabilities and what that looks like in the Libyan context. So if we just start with prevailing need, and in particularly with regard to the protection environment, whilst it's appreciated and even celebrated that in some respects humanitarian need has reduced in Libya, and that's really, really good to note, of course. My concern is that with that overarching emphasis that we perhaps miss out on some of the pockets of need that Jean-Nicolas also referred to. And maybe I can reference the MSNA data, for example, comparatively from 2021 to 2022, where we have seen an increase in protection and living standard gaps for both Libyans and non-Libyans in Libya. I'd also like to refer to the recent report in October in 2021 from the UN fact-finding mission to the HRC, which noted dire conditions in terms of the human rights situation in Libya. And that's something that I think we also need to keep in the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about exiting in Libya. Also, just to note, the Mixed Migration Center has some really interesting and useful information and analysis around migration trends and what that looks like. And we have to note that there's been at least 32,000 people that were intercepted at sea in 2021 alone by the Libyan Coast Guard, which was a 173% increase on the previous year. And as we all know, the response to that in terms of the disembarkation point in Libya is arrest and detention and being housed in detention centres. And again, we're all very clear on the prevailing human rights abuses and challenges that take place, including impediments to humanitarian assistance within the detention centre system. I'll also just quickly reference the landmine challenge that we have in Libya. Again, data is difficult to collect. Of course, the Mine Action Authority have been doing a fantastic job in trying to collate information through non-technical surveys, etc., supported by organizations such as DRC and others. But for example, in just 4 locations, Benghazi, Tripoli, Derna and Sirte, we understand that there's 30 million square meters of confirmed hazardous areas, with a further 6 million square meters of suspected hazardous areas. These kinds of issues also present barriers to return for internally displaced people within Libya. And this is also compounded by challenges that we have with prevailing ethnic tensions, for example, that have yet to be addressed in support of social cohesion. Also damage to infrastructure that happened over the years with the conflict, as well as actually damage to the economy, which impedes livelihood opportunities and the delivery of services, etc., in a lot of these areas. And so I think it is important that we are noting any positions or plans around exit strategy, to be cognizant also of this prevailing and existing need, and particularly around the protection environment. With that, I'd like to move to the point around transitional processes, which Hema noted in quite a bit of detail, actually. And of course, Atja and our colleagues in the humanitarian community are working very hard to consider what happens after May, after the HRP ends, and looking at, for example, a supplementary HRP process, which may take us up until the end of 2022. I think we're all in agreement that the challenges involved with bringing that forward in the volatile and changeable political context, but also noting that even up until the end of 2022 is not sufficient for us to be considering. We need to be looking beyond that in terms of what a transitional process would look like. And there are many examples that we can learn from globally and how this has worked, and more notably, unfortunately, how this has not worked. Our colleagues in NRC here in Libya completed a really interesting piece of analysis, actually, on some of those transitional processes that took place in other countries. And it was interesting to note, again, comments from Jean-Nicolas and from Hema on what these transitional processes look like in the context of some existing humanitarian needs. And one of the key lessons learned that was put forward by the humanitarian coordinator in Haiti, for example, following the transitional process, was to note that, in fact, it wasn't a sequential issue that needed to be addressed, but rather a convergence of issues and needs. So looking at the existing humanitarian needs, responding to those, whilst at the same time planning effectively for transition going forward. And I think that any consideration around exit would need to look at having that solid transition plan in place, but while still addressing the prevailing pockets and issues around humanitarian need, to ensure that that isn't further compounded and actually impede on the transitional process, as we have seen in other contexts. So then lastly, I'll speak about accountability and our accountabilities within this, within these discussions that we're having, and as I suppose, influencers and actors and stakeholders in Libya. So primarily, of course, we are accountable to the people with whom we work here in the Libyan context, be it Libyans or non-Libyans. And it's for us to ensure that any pullback of assistance is met with the provision of services, and access to assistance as it's required. Secondly, I think that it's important to acknowledge the role, of course, of the Libyan government, which Hema also pointed out very clearly, and that when we are handing over, that we're doing that to an entity that has the authority and the mandate to govern the country effectively, and can actually take up the delivery of these services, again, not to impede on or lose the gains from the assistance and the investment from our donors, from civil society, from communities themselves, and of course from the INGO community. We all want the same thing. We all want to see Libya thriving for both Libyans and non-Libyans, but it's important that we do this noting our accountabilities and using this phased approach. And maybe lastly, I'll say that there are examples from other countries that we can learn on perhaps more positively. In Somalia, for example, they have what's noted as the Somalia Stability Fund, which is a fund that's managed by a group of donors that support initiatives for longer term, more sustainable development and recovery initiatives, whilst at the same time humanitarian assistance is provided where it's needed. So for me, what I would say is that in going forward, it's important that we're having conversations like we're having today. It's important that we engage local organizations and civil society in the communities that we work. It's important that we're engaging between the UN community and of course the INGO community, and together with the Libyan authorities, to have this dialogue, to understand what the continued need is, to understand what the barriers and opportunities are for transition, and pull together a solid, coherent and collaborative plan that we can all speak to and all support in terms of implementation. Thank you so much. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Aglo. Thanks to all of you. I can say that so many of the things that you've pointed out are really have strong echoes for me in our work with the IRC, and from speaking to so many of the other organizations working here, working in Libya. I do feel like we feel like we're not really quite prepared for a transition in a way. Many of us, Jean-Nicolas pointed out the work on sewage systems. I think we as IRC, and this isn't just in Libya, but in other countries in the MENA region, we find ourselves transitioning internally to try and do better at bridging the humanitarian to longer term work, not even development so much in some cases, but it's a struggle. But it actually, I mean, I think for us, you know, and we work mostly in the health sector, and we started out working in replacing the state, I think as Jean-Nicolas had mentioned, or maybe Gemma, which was a short-term thing and didn't last. And we find that there are aspects of the among our partners in Libya and in the Libyan government who are strong links in the chain and can be built and support, almost like a mentoring program. In which we work together to try and reestablish those accountabilities that Avro was mentioning, and make sure that the state is capable of providing citizens with the services that they need to survive. But it feels sort of piecemeal in Libya. And one of the things, well, there's two aspects that come to mind listening to you. One is, you know, the degree to which the development actors and those actors that we will theoretically be passing the baton to as Libya's conflict hopefully ends. And I do feel like it is, you know, the risk we're facing these days as the two prime ministers jockey for position, etc., is not the same as it was 2 years ago, 2019. At least I tend to be overly optimistic, but I don't feel like we're heading back to that kind of conflict, not least because some of the external actors are not acting in the same ways and are more in concord. But there is a risk of that. But in any case, I feel like maybe we're so busy doing our own programs that we don't engage the development actors as much as we should. So that's one thing I would like to put on the table to discuss a little bit. They haven't been active with the humanitarian country team, and that's, you know, by definition, the humanitarian country team is more humanitarian. But there are other actors who are investing quite a lot in Libya that are not represented there. And the question is, as Gemma said, what is the forum for them? So I see she has her hand up, but I also want to point to the issue of funding, because as an INGO, this is something that we are faced with, and it's quite difficult. We recognize that the donor landscape is changing, and there are some of our most reliable and closest humanitarian partners, like ECHO or like the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs in the US. They tell us the funding is decreasing, and they say, you know, you should be speaking to some of the more developmental donors. But they haven't really picked up yet, at least not in our experience. In some cases, it is happening, but my sense is that there's no master plan, and it's a little bit ad hoc. So maybe, Gemma, we can start with you on the first point, or either point, before turning to the other speakers about the donor side of this and the financing of it.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you also to Jan Nicholas and April, because I think that we are all in the same page. I mean, we have been raising the same issues. I think that one of the key components that it's happening in Libya, at least since I arrived in 2019, it was like there is a very blurred line in between what is development, what is humanitarian. There is a tendency in this country to see that the worst off of the people in need is the people in the humanitarian caseload. And sometimes we are mixing that. I'm not saying that, when we are talking about exiting the humanitarian, it doesn't mean that we have to exit. There are still several needs there. There are people that, as humanitarians, we have been patching up somehow. We have been putting the people out of the critical situation into still having some needs that needs to be addressed. If nobody's taking over, I remember in my previous years, I worked as an NGO for 18 years, and I always said the same. It's like every second year I can renew my beneficiary list, because, you work with them for a year, they're a bit better off, but if nobody's there to take over and continue building their resilience, people will go down again will be dragged again into humanitarian situation. And that's why we really need to have in place a proper development system, development framework based on a national development plan. I mean, this is very difficult to build somehow. We are used as humanitarians. I was discussing with my development with RCO colleagues actually yesterday. It's like, yeah, I mean, looking at how the situation is now in Libya, how much is all the development process that has been going on for almost a year and a half now going to give the fruits that we expect to be in place by January 2023? If they are not in place there, who is going to take over? How are we going to ensure that all the efforts put forward are going to go into the same direction? Are we be ready to transition at this point or not? Those are the big questions that we need to look at. And that's why stability is key for this. If you don't have a counterpart to talk to, being OCHA, being RCO, being yourselves as NGOs, how are we going to ensure that the situation is solid enough to continue building on it and to be able to address all the root cases that are creating all those needs? And for me, this is a very important aspect that we have to look at before deciding what we are going to do looking forward. The other thing, I totally agree with April. I mean, it's very simple for, looking at as an intersector coordinator chair, looking at the sectors, very easy to transition for WASH, education, some of those ones. But what happened with protection? What happened with the areas of responsibility under protection? That's not that easy. That's not that easy. We have seen that in many countries where then, unless you have a very solid framework looking at all those considerations, those fall in the cracks. And these people remain still being in humanitarian situations somehow. Those are key of the aspects that we really need to look in detail when we decide when is the right moment to exit and how we do it. I mean, phase approach, absolutely. There's nothing, it's very different for OCHA. We look at systems and procedures. As NGOs, you deliver. So it's a very completely different situation. You can try to look at, okay, how are we going to have a kind of a transitional programs where we still tackle some of the pockets of humanitarian needs at the same time that we can try to look at how to build the resilience and how to consolidate all those gains. But for that, you need flexibility from donors that they are open to say, okay, that's not a pure this or pure that system. And then is when also the role of the donors in all this situation has to, be involved and be part of the decisions and this phase approach. Over.
Thank you, Gemma. Would either of the other panelists like to comment?
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, thank you so much for those points, Hema. And for sure, it's very much appreciated in terms of OCHA's position, looking at systems and procedures, and point well taken in terms of the, I suppose, the focus on delivery really from the INGO community, also in support of local organisations where feasible and appropriate. But when we're thinking about that longer term plan and that transition, certainly also the INGO community are very keen to tap into and link to and be cognizant of the kind of broader macro political and socioeconomic environment. And for us, that's key when we're thinking about sustainable exit strategies, even for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And for us, like having that counterpart or having that capability even to facilitate that transition is key. And it's not only a consideration, I suppose, for us as INGOs, but also then for our donors and those that provide the resources and the investment into that kind of assistance. Because what we're finding now, and maybe to speak back to Tom's point around funding, is that we are seeing that decrease in humanitarian assistance right now. That is very much the reality of the situation. And we haven't so much seen the pickup or the intervention perhaps from a resource perspective, from maybe some of the more longer term sustainable type opportunities from donors, etc. And when we have this gap, it does lead to a reduction in need being met, but also a loss of the gains that have already been made. And in particular, again, when we go back to accountability for those with who we work with, and Hema, you mentioned that very clearly, that you support an individual or a household or a community to a point, and then if there's nothing to hand over to, then those gains can be lost. But it's also from a point of view from the donors themselves, like losing that investment, that resource that's been provided, in terms of moving backwards rather than forwards. And also from an INGO perspective, we've had to close offices, we've had to reduce sectors. We're losing team members, which is all very difficult to build back up then should the situation require it, which of course we always hope it doesn't, but we do need to remain agile and adaptive. And I think that that's been challenged at this particular time. So again, coming back to accountability, we really do need to have a collaborative approach, and particularly with our donors and where the resources are coming from, to ensure that we have that space for that transition, that we have something clear that we're handing over to. And we also have the flexibility to be developing the evidence and the kind of longer term plans within that also. Over.
Thank you, Avril. Before I ask Jean-Nicolas, I could also say that I think we should have time for people in the audience. If they'd like to raise any points, feel free to raise your hand. And we should have time for a wider discussion, I think. Jean-Nicolas, would you like to add anything?
No, I maybe will leave up to the audience to ask some questions, because I concur with what Gemma and Ravi just said. I mean, the fundamental question here is the system ready, or is the situation ready for the transition? And that takes, of course, as we said before, the development actors and the authorities. And seeing the situation today, the priority of the authorities might very much differ to what we think is important to focus on. I mean, today it is a bit thinking in the blue. If we may have a plan or thinking about transition, but the situation today doesn't allow to start with a real transition. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. So I hope you can all hear me. We can open up the floor for other conversations. I don't see any hands at the moment. I would say that I think it was Avril that raised the point about human rights as well, and the question of whether there is a fabric to protect and defend human rights in Libya. And it just, my thought, having worked on other emergencies like Syria, is that there is less and less of a commitment by the international community to not by the international community, but there are people who don't even at the level of the UN Security Council, who don't obviously respect human rights and use conflict to further their own aims, and that makes it difficult. And also I think that as we look, we just had a conference of country directors for IRC in the Middle East, and over as we shared our concerns, it seemed like the question of how states can finance these services is coming in more and more into question. And this is something I think that, we look at Libya, which is we all refer to as a wealthier country, but they have difficulty in how they distribute their resources. And then there are countries who are middle-income countries who are increasingly finding challenges to finance these kinds of development initiatives themselves, and take on things like in the health sector, the imbalance in human resources, for example. So it's clear that these are not things that humanitarian organizations themselves can take on. So it's a tremendous challenge. I don't see any hands, and if there are no questions or contributions,
you have several hands.
I'm sorry, I can't see them. Can you
Okay,
tell
you
me,
have
Gemma?
Catherine and you can Jack asking for the floor.
Okay, I don't know who went first, but let's go with Catherine. Sorry about that.
Hi there, good morning. I'm Catherine from DRC. So I just wanted to touch on the relationship of INGOs of local Libyan organizations, just because this relationship plays such a key role when we're thinking about sustainable exit strategies and transition. And I know that as INGOs, we talk such a lot about doing assessments and capacity building, but as INGOs, we also know that dealing with donors, different compliance requirements can be, challenging even for us. So I'm just wondering, from everyone's perspective and experience, what can be some key ways that we can really effectively prepare these local Libyan organizations for working with their own communities in the future? Thank you.
Why don't we also take Jack's question, since we only have a few minutes left? That's okay. Jack?
No, go ahead. Go ahead and talk to Catherine's point, because I'm also interested in what she was asking. So go ahead.
Okay. All right.
If you have time, you'll come back to me. No worries.
Okay, sure thing, Jack. Who would like to respond to that question around preparing?
Answer to that a bit. In order to strengthen the capacity on assessments, data collection and analysis, we have been working together with some of your colleagues, and also with REACH and with IOM, in order to do some training and capacity building of local organizations, not only national counterparts, but government and non-governmental one, in order to build the capacity for data collection and analysis in rapid needs assessment. It was a tool that it was agreed with the assessment working group, so most of your colleagues collaborate on that. So it's a common effort that is really looking at that, and we are planning to continue these efforts in 2022. Some of the, I would say that the success of it is not 100%. I mean, there is people that they are really, really involved and they really learn, and we can have been used afterwards for the MSNA with REACH for the data collection. In other cases, maybe we just need to reinforce the training, but this is something we are building on. And then the other one, as I was mentioning, is the effort with the Ministry of Social Affairs. They have 113 teams all across 6 municipalities in Libya. I'm very excited about this initiative. I know that in CANFOR cases, I know that we can move forward, and we had a meeting with REACH just the day after we signed the agreement, and they are also on board with that. So we're going to plan all the training of the teams. We are going to do the numerators. And if everything goes well, MSNA this year will be based on a same pack of data collection and analysis. So it can be an amazing step forward. We are not only looking at humanitarian indicators, working with the sectors on how to tweak the ones of last year, but at the same time, include some development transitional indicators so it can give us a bit better grip of where are we in Libya and what needs to be next. Said that, yeah, it can go fantastic. It can fall in pieces one day because the agreement is not holding, but we have our hopes very high on that because we are trying to do that at technical level rather than political level, and that people normally remains whenever changes might or might not come. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Avril, you had your hand up for Catherine's question.
I did. Thank you so much. And thanks, Catherine, for the question. And maybe I'll approach your response from two perspectives. One, looking at the operating environment, and the second, looking at capacities. So maybe firstly on the operating environment, in Libya, in terms of the establishment or the history maybe around civil society, it's perhaps not what we would see as pervasive perhaps in maybe some other contexts that we would work in. Now, there are some really strong organizations doing some really, really great work, but I suppose comparatively in terms of the operating environment, there has been some challenges. Like for us as organizations, you know, especially international organizations, we're very clear that we work in Libya on the invitation of and in support of the Libyan authorities, and we are very keen to be very transparent and of course accountable around the work that we do. However, in recent times, increasingly, we have seen some restrictions on the operating environment, impeding our ability to be able to access populations in need and to be able to provide services. And some of these impediments and barriers are also felt by local civil society organizations. And so I think it's important for us, particularly at the international level, that when we're talking about humanitarian access, or we're talking about access from individual services, that we're doing that leveraging our international position, let's say, in support of local organizations to be able to navigate the operating environment, to be able to deliver the services themselves. And then secondly, what I'd say about capacity, again, some really strong organizations working in Libya. There's one in particular that comes to mind, the Free Fields Foundation, 3F, which DRC and previously the Danish Mining Group, DDG, which is now, of course, part of DRC, supported over the years to become an independent organization that's now accessing international funding by themselves, which is fantastic. And the work that they're doing is incredible. But just to note that there are, of course, significant compliance requirements and investments in support service capacity, for example, within these organizations that also needs to happen. So I suppose my plea on that would be to work very closely with our donors again to ensure that there are processes and resources in place that when we are working with local civil society organizations, that we can invest in those local capacities, particularly around governance and frameworks and processes, etc., so that those organizations can continue and can hopefully attract the investment and tap into the resources that they need to be able to implement going forward as well. Over.
Thanks, Avril. And just to second what you're saying, I do feel like among the NGOs, and you can hear it in the discussions at the forum, at the Libyan NGO forum, that there is this very strong commitment to developing local partners, and we as IRC, in fact, are now required in many ways to do much more in terms of partner selection and development, which is really long overdue. And I think that among donors, they also reflect that in the parameters of their mechanisms. So I think it's got a long way to go, but I do feel like that has changed. We do have a couple of minutes, Jack, unless anyone else, or Jean-Nicolas, did you want to say anything about that question? Yes,
yeah, maybe.
Please do.
We are, as traditionally, as ICC, we work with our movements partners, and here in Libya, the Libyan Red Crescent, and mainly, but we have as well other partnership with other local NGO organisms. There is one element in Libya that we should not underestimate. If I compare that with other places where I was working in Afghanistan, Yemen, or Mali, it's the duration of the partnership that we have with such organization. It's still a very short period of time. We still, as an international organization, need to better understand what are their way of operating, their constraints, their difficulties, and they maybe have some of the way to better understand what does that mean, this international versus local aid organization, and how does that work together. For us, at least in ICC terms, the Libyan context is still a very young one. It's only 10 years, and we've been in Afghanistan for more than 40. So, and the relationship with local organization, and for us, the Libyan Red Crescent, is something that needs to be further developed. It's not as it is in other contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack, why don't you ask your question?
Thank you. It's sort of related to that previous discussion. So in talking about handing over things to local organizations, or how international organizations sort of slowly pull out of Libya, a lot of the speakers mentioned this move to development funding. However, as many of you know, there is no development funding on the immediate horizon, maybe something further on, and the things that are being talked about are rather limited when compared to humanitarian response funding 3 years ago. So it's a challenge for me to reconcile where these local organizations would get access to international funding if international funding is or will be so limited in the future. And on top of that, many of the speakers, which thank you very much for such an excellent presentation, all of you. It was very interesting and informative. Many of you mentioned sort of comparisons to other contexts that are much more stereotypically humanitarian, one could say, Somalia or Haiti. But the context of Libya is so different in that Libya has its own sovereign wealth fund. Libya, especially now with oil at such a high price, has enormous resources at its command in many ways. So that aspect really shouldn't be forgotten. And I don't think it is from a donor perspective that it's hard to continue funding a country that has access to this amount of financial resource. So that's, I don't know, that's something that should be in the background of all these conversations. But yeah, so I guess less a question, more a comment of things that should not be forgotten. On the subject of these local organizations and increasing scrutiny on them, Avril raises a great point that this sort of increased scrutiny from the government or from various governmental authorities will only continue. And if international organizations start to pull out, local organizations, as they already are, will feel the brunt of this internal security apparatus, various civil society commission pressure to kind of shape the way they respond to things. So that's something else that we as an international community can't really do much about, but should be very cognizant that anything we do or any organization we support locally, in some ways we make them more of a target, one could say, because of our assistance or because of our relationship with them. So that's something that I think all of our organizations should be cognizant of moving forward in partnerships with local organizations. Over.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's a very relevant point, and I do feel like we haven't talked much about the hostility towards civil society generally in Libya, which is quite severe. And you point out that that in fact having an international organization supporting them may make them more of a target, but it also calls us to a greater responsibility to ensure that we do what we can to help them and protect them. And I feel like the discourse around this with the EU, for example, and other governments that are active in Libya is helpful and has evolved quite a bit. So I'm encouraged by that, but it is a very important point. Now, Gemma, maybe you see some hands. I don't see any others. I think we're coming towards the top of the hour, and so the end of our time. I'd like to thank all the participants, the speakers. I think it was very good. In a short period of time, we covered a lot of issues. I'd like to thank the people that called in. Saw a lot of familiar faces there, and we look forward to the wider forum to come. Thanks very much, everyone.